Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something really exciting. We're peeling back the layers of myth, the legends, and, centuries of deep devotion to uncover the radical philosophy and the actual historical mystery of the Buddha. We are so used to seeing him as this serene, quiet statue, right? But the historical figure, he was a wandering ascetic, an absolutely profound psychological thinker, and honestly, a social revolutionary who completely turned the ancient Indian world upside down. Okay, let's look at our roadmap. We're breaking this down into 6 parts. The search for Siddhartha, the Great Renunciation, the Middle Way, core teachings and philosophy, a social revolution, and finally, the eternal icon. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the search for Siddhartha. So, who was the historical Buddha? It's honestly a massive historical puzzle. I mean, imagine a figure as incredibly famous as the Buddha, and yet there are absolutely no written records from his actual lifetime. Not a single contemporary document. Zero. The very first solid, tangible evidence we have comes from Emperor Ashoka's stone pillars, and those were carved centuries after he lived. Because we have this huge gap in the records, scholars fiercely debate when he actually walked the earth. The texts basically give us 2 main chronologies. You've got the long chronology that comes from Sri Lankan chronicles, putting his life between 566 and 486 BCE. But then, Indian sources point to a short chronology, which pushes his timeline way forward, over a century later, to somewhere between 448 and 368 BCE. But, regardless of which timeline you go with, he definitely lived during an era of explosive intellectual upheaval. What's really fascinating is how he actually viewed himself. If you look at the earliest texts, he almost never uses his personal name. Instead, he preferred the title Tathagata. It's this profound, kind of mysterious term that translates roughly to one who has thus gone or one who has thus come. He's basically saying he's moved completely beyond the ordinary coming and going of our worldly, impermanent lives. He's totally immeasurable. Moving right along to Section 2, the Great Renunciation. Now, according to the legendary biographies, young Gautama's worldview was completely shattered by 4 encounters outside his incredibly sheltered palace. See, his father had tried to literally hide the world's suffering from him, hoping he'd become this great secular king. But when he finally ventured out, the prince saw 4 things: an old man, a diseased man, a decaying corpse, and finally, a wandering ascetic. These 4 sights forced him to confront the absolute, inescapable realities of aging, sickness, and death. Those visceral experiences violently awakened him to this concept of dukkha. Now, we usually translate dukkha as suffering, but a better way to think of it is standing unstable. It's that deep-seated dissatisfaction, that unease that comes when we expect permanent happiness from impermanent things. You know the feeling, right? It's like finally buying that one thing you really wanted, only to feel totally empty about it a week later. Realizing this was the universal human condition, he made a radical choice. He left his royal life, left his wife and child in the middle of the night to go find a cure for it all. Which brings us to Section 3, the Middle Way. Now, it's absolutely crucial to remember that Gautama wasn't just sitting alone meditating in a vacuum. He stepped into a wildly vibrant, super crowded intellectual landscape. Early texts, like the Brahmajala Sutta, literally record 62 rival philosophical schools operating at the exact same time. 62! This was the age of the Shramanas, these wandering ascetics, skeptics, and materialists. It really highlights the sheer scale and the fiercely competitive nature of the environment he was navigating and actively debating in. To find his answer, Gautama decided to test out the extremes. Obviously, he already knew the extreme of sensual indulgence. He'd lived that out as a sheltered prince. So he swung to the other side and tried severe asceticism. The texts describe him doing intense breath control and literally starving himself until you could see his spine through his stomach. But it didn't work. He realized that nearly starving himself to death didn't lead to awakening any more than living in luxury did. He needed a middle path. Let's dive into Section 4, Core Teachings and Philosophy. So sitting under the Bodhi tree, having finally eaten and restored his strength, he found that middle path and struck upon an incredibly radical idea for his time: anatta, or no self. Back then, Vedic and Jain traditions were constantly arguing about the nature of the eternal soul. But the Buddha, he argued that everything is just a process. He said, we actually lack a permanent, unchanging core self. Instead, we're just made up of 5 shifting aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Basically, our sense of I is just a convenient label we slap onto these constantly changing physical and mental phenomena. And to escape the suffering of this existence, he didn't tell people to pray to the gods. He taught a highly practical, step-by-step training of the mind. That meant understanding the Four Noble Truths and walking the Noble Eightfold Path. It's a system. By practicing strict ethical conduct, mastering sense restraint, developing mindfulness, or sati, and entering deep meditative states known as dhyana, a person can literally extinguish the internal fires of desire, hatred, and ignorance. The actual mechanics of how this all works comes down to a concept called dependent origination. It's essentially a chain reaction. Because we're ignorant of how impermanent things are and this idea of no self, we start claiming things as I or mine, right? That appropriation creates attachment and craving, which then fuels karma, which keeps driving us through an endless cycle of rebirth and dissatisfaction. The whole point of his path is to find the weak link in that chain and break it. Next up, Section 5, a social revolution. Now, the Buddha wasn't just some solitary mystic living in the woods. His teaching sparked a massive shift in the bustling new cities of the Ganges Basin. The dominant Vedic tradition of the time claimed that their rigid caste system was put in place by the gods. The Buddha completely rejected that. He said outright that a person's worth is determined by their moral actions, not their bloodline or birth. Because of this radically egalitarian view, his monastic order welcomed literally everyone. They even brought in people who the rest of society considered untouchable. It was a real game changer. And he kept at it. For 45 years after his awakening, he tirelessly walked across the Gangetic Plain. He didn't isolate himself at all. He engaged directly with the world. He debated rival philosophers, gave advice to kings, and changed the lives of ordinary people. He even famously converted a literal serial killer named Angulimala. For decades, right up until he died in his 80s, he promoted a universal moral law to absolutely anyone who was willing to listen. Finally, Section 6, the eternal icon. After his death, an event known as his parinirvana, his cremated relics were divided up, and his identity started to undergo a massive cosmic evolution. This is especially true in later Mahayana texts. He transforms from this human renunciant who figured out a way to stop suffering into an eternal, unconditioned cosmic presence. In this later framework, his entire historical human life was actually just a skillful manifestation, a teaching tool used by a timeless entity to help guide countless beings across infinite universes toward enlightenment. Mind-bending stuff, right? And over the centuries, his legacy rippled way beyond just Buddhism. Different world religions recognized the sheer spiritual weight of his story and actually wove him into their own sacred histories. In Hinduism, he was adopted as the 9th avatar of the god Vishnu. In Christianity, his life story traveled west and morphed into the popular legend of Saint Josaphat. Islamic texts sometimes equated him with a prophet or the figure Al-Qiz. And the Baha'i faith officially recognizes him as a manifestation of God. His impact was literally global. But for the historical man himself, his entire philosophy is basically captured perfectly in the final words he spoke right before passing away. He said, "All sankharas decay," meaning all conditioned things, everything that is put together, will eventually fall apart. Therefore, what actually matters is our action. He told his followers to strive for the goal with diligence. He could point the way, but he was adamant that they had to walk the path themselves. So, we're going to leave you with this thought to ponder long after this explainer wraps up. In our modern world, a world full of extreme opinions, digital overload, and this constant, exhausting grasping for the next big thing, how might finding your own balance between extremes bring a little clarity to your chaotic life today? Think about it. Thanks so much for exploring the fascinating reality and the profound legacy of the Awakened One with us.